I hope it works better than yesterday. But here we are, guys. Here we are. Hope you guys are doing good. Looks like it's way up. Maybe that's better. So what else? What else should we? Well, that's the running. Let's choose. Let's choose somewhere cool. Oh, well, I think this works. So we did, let me see, is there a video that's about to drop? Oh, this is the other one. I switch this. And let's go to content. It's all dropped. Um, oh, May 2nd. Is today May 3rd? 2nd. That dropped today. Then I just accidentally dropped another one. Hmm. Let's see why. So the so technically, not all games will. Okay. I think the app is really powerful and strong. And like I said, my computer is not good. I cannot be using my computer to live stream at all. Let's see. It's freezing. It literally freezes in the middle of whatever you're trying to do. So annoying. So annoying. Mm.
Introduction of Every Man at War 60 Personal Narratives of the War. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ted Leinhart. Every Man at War 60 Personal Narratives of the War. Edited by Charles Benjamin Purdom. Introduction. These narratives of the war are not the work of practiced writers, but of soldiers telling their personal experiences. They have therefore an interest that war novels or stories or official records do not possess. A few of them are by sailors and by men in the Air Force and by women, but the greater number are by men of various ranks who served on the different fronts, most of them as privates in France and Flanders. They show what war is from the soldier's point of view. It is a restricted point of view, of course, but it is concerned with realities and for that reason important. The narratives came to be written in this way. A few months ago, a friend was talking to me with admiration of Barbusse's Le Feu and remarked incidentally that he had not yet written his own story of the war, though he intended to do so before he got too old. He served in the ranks in Flanders during practically the whole period of the war, and had, he thought, something to tell that had not yet been told. I urged him to sit down and write his account before it had gone from his mind, and he went away declaring that he would start upon it that very day. But he has not done it, and I do not think he ever will. There are many men in the same position. They have something to tell about the war, but have never been induced to put it on record. There is a deep reluctance in most men to write of things with which they were so closely concerned. To most of them, the war was not an event. It was their lives stretched to the most painful degree of tension and desperate effort of which they were capable. Many men have never recovered from the numbing effect of the war upon their senses. They do not wish to recall all that happened in those dreadful years. Yet the world loses by the silence of those who have knowledge. And for the full lesson of the war to be learned, as many as possible of those who know what it meant should put their experiences on record. With that in mind, I invited the readers of Every Man to send me accounts of their actual war experiences in not more than 3,000 words, offering a small prize for the best narrative received. In the course of a few weeks, I received over 300 narratives, of which 289 were worth serious consideration. I did not expect so remarkable a result. At least half of them deserved to be printed, and I finally came to the conclusion that a selection of the very best should be made into a book. The writers have been asked to relate their experiences straightforwardly and simply. Good writing was not expected. The result was that the bulk of the manuscripts were plain statements of fact recording experiences that were deeply felt. The amount of literary effort was remarkably small. A certain number adopted the short story form, but these were mostly rejected, and only a few are included in this volume. Most of the manuscripts were handwritten. Some of them were substantiated by diaries and other papers. On the whole, the narratives did not seem to suffer from exaggeration. I ask the reader to judge that for himself from the selection in the following pages. Indeed, understatement was characteristic of many of them. They were very English in that respect. Some made comments on the war, deeply resenting its effects on themselves or its social and political results. I have not included much comment of the sort. Here and there, a tendency to overdo the horrors was shown, but there was remarkably little bad language. The narratives are of various kinds. Some relate to single incidents, others give a general impression of war experience. Some, as I have indicated, were written from diaries, others from deeply engraved memory. Some of them are human documents of the first order. Major events in the history of the war are referred to from time to time, but generally the narratives present personal experience. It is noticeable that hardly any feeling against the enemy is expressed. Only two writers refer to the Germans as Huns, or Jerry is the usual epithet. I have interfered with the narratives as little as possible in editing them, checking names of places as far as I could, and clearing up doubtful points. but the writers speak with their own natural rhythm and style. The cumulative effect of these narratives is impressive. They seem to me to give a more convincing sense of the war than any war book that I have yet seen. They are best read, I venture to think, so as to get this cumulative effect. I have arranged them in the order of events as far as possible. I regret that there are so few from the Navy, but one of them by a seaman is an extremely vivid piece of writing. The impression that I get from reading them is not that of suffering or horror, but of the senselessness of war. No one who served in it but was oppressed more or less constantly by its futility. Its political effects were far reaching, but as a method of state action, we discovered it to be without any redeeming features. In the narratives printed here, the war is looked at from the point of view of individual men engaged in it. These men do not lose their human qualities, their courage, honesty, chivalry, and spirit of self sacrifice, but those qualities themselves are seen to lose their value, for man surrenders himself to the machine, and all that makes life worth living is gone. The truth about war is that it is an evil, not only because men suffer and die in it, but because it destroys the meaning of life. For that reason, wars must be made to cease, and the lesson of the Great War is that war must be prevented in the future. War is not an adventure, but a disaster. It has no glamour or romance or nobility, but wars can be prevented only in times of peace. And if the lesson of the last war is learned now, we shall see that the relations between states make wars unnecessary. When war comes, there is nothing left but to do one's duty in it, as these men did, whose stories are printed here. C.B. Purdom, London, February 1930. End of introduction. Section 1 of Every Man at War, 60 Personal Narratives of the War, edited by Charles Benjamin Purdom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Linehart. The Old Contemptibles, 1914. The Retreat from Mons, August 23rd to September 5th, 1914, by Bernard John Denor. August 23rd. We had been marching since 2:30 a.m., and about 11:15 a.m., an order was passed down for A Company, my company, to deploy to the right and dig in on the south bank of a railway cutting. We deployed and started digging in, but as the soil was mostly chalk, we were able to make only shallow holes. While we were digging, the German artillery opened fire. The range was perfect, about 6 shells at a time bursting in line directly over our heads. All of us except the company commander fell flat on our faces, frightened and surprised. But after a while we got up and looked over the rough parapet we had thrown up and could not see much. One or two men had been wounded and one was killed. There was a town about 1 mile away on our left front, and a lot of movement was going on round about it, and there was a small village called Binch on our right, where there was a lot of heavy firing going on, rifle and artillery. We saw the Germans attack on our left in great masses, but they were beaten back by the Coldstream Guards. A squadron of German cavalry crossed our front about 800 yards distant, and we opened fire on them. We hit a few, and the fact that we were doing something definite improved our morale immensely. It took away a lot of our nervousness. The artillery fire from the Germans was very heavy, but was dropping behind us on a British battery. The company officer, who had stayed in the open all the time, had taken a couple of men to help get the wounded away from the battery behind us. He returned about 6:30 p.m. when the firing had died down a bit and told us the battery had been blown to bits. I was then sent with 4 men on outpost to a signal box at a level crossing and found it was being used as a clearing station for wounded. After dark, more wounded were brought in from the Ninth Battery RFA, the battery that was cut up. One man was in a very bad way and kept shrieking out for somebody to bring a razor and cut his throat, and 2 others died almost immediately. I was going to move a bundle of hay when someone called out, "Look out, chum, there's a bloke in there." I saw a leg completely severed from its body and suddenly felt very sick and tired. The German rifle fire started again, and an artilleryman to whom I was talking was shot dead. I was sick then. Nothing much happened during the night, except that one man spent the time kissing a string of rosary beads, and another swore practically the whole night. August 24th, just about dawn, a party of Germans came near, and we opened fire on them and hit quite a number. We thought of following them up, but a corporal brought an order to retire. We joined the company again behind the trenches and learned that the town we could see was Mons. After a while, we joined up with the rest of the battalion on the road and went back the same route we covered coming up. All the time, there was plenty of firing going on by Givry, and about midday, we deployed and opened fire on a regiment of German cavalry. They dismounted and returned our fire, which was all rapid and was telling on them. Then suddenly they mounted and disappeared out of range. We continued marching back for about 4 hours. Then again, we deployed and opened fire on more German cavalry, but this time they kept out of range and eventually moved off altogether. My platoon was sent forward to a small village where we stayed all night, firing occasionally at what we hoped were German cavalry. August 25th. We started off about 5 a.m., still retiring, and so far we had had no food since Sunday the 23rd. All day long we marched, and although a lot of firing was going on, we did none of it. About 6:30 p.m. we got to a place called Moroils, and my platoon spent the night guarding a bridge over a stream. The Germans attacked about 9 p.m. and kept it up all night, but didn't get into Moroils. About 45 of the company were killed or wounded, including the company officer. A voice had called out in English, "Has anybody got a map?" And when our CO stood up with his map, a German walked up and shot him with a revolver. The German was killed by a bayonet stab from a private. August 26th. The Germans withdrew at dawn, and soon after we continued retiring, and had not been on the march very long before we saw a French regiment, which showed that all of them had not deserted us. We marched all day long, miles and miles it seemed, probably owing to the fact that we had had no sleep at all since Saturday the 22nd, and had had very little food to eat, and the marching discipline was not good. I myself frequently felt very sick. We had a bit of a fight at night, and what made matters worse was that it happened at Venerols, the village we were billeted in before we went up to Mons. Anyway, the Germans retired from the fight. August 27th. At dawn, we started on the march again. I noticed that the cure and one old fellow stayed in Venerols, but all the other inhabitants went the previous night. A lot of our men threw away their overcoats while we were on the road today, but I kept mine. The marching was getting quite disorderly. Numbers of men from other regiments were mixed up with us. We reached St. Quentin, a nice town, just before dark, but marched straight through and dug ourselves in on some high ground with a battery of artillery in line with us. Although we saw plenty of movement in the town, the Germans didn't attack us, neither did we fire on them. During the night, a man near me quite suddenly started squealing like a pig, and then jumped out of the trench, ran straight down the hill towards the town, and shot himself through the foot. He was brought in by some artillerymen. August 28th. Again at dawn, we started on the march, and during the first halt, another fellow shot himself through the foot. The roads were in a terrible state. The heat was terrific. There seemed to be very little order about anything. And mixed up with us and wandering about all over the road were refugees with all sorts of conveyances, prams, trucks, wheelbarrows, and tiny little carts drawn by dogs. They were piled up with what looked like beds and bedding, and all of them asked us for food, which we could not give them, as we had none ourselves. The men were discarding their equipment in a wholesale fashion, in spite of orders to the contrary. Also, many of them fell out and rejoined again towards dusk. They had been riding on limbers and wagons and officers' chargers, and generally looked worse than those of us who kept going all day. That night I went on outpost, but I did not know where exactly, as things were getting hazy in my mind. I tried to keep a diary, although it was against orders. Anyway, I couldn't realize all that was happening, and only knew that I was always tired, hungry, unshaven, and dirty. My feet were sore, water was scarce. In fact, it was issued in half pints, as we were not allowed to touch the native water. The regulations were kept in force in that respect, so much so that two men were put under arrest and sentenced to field punishment for stealing bread from an empty house. Then again, it wasn't straight marching. For every few hours, we had to deploy and beat off an attack, and every time somebody I knew was killed or wounded. And after we had beaten off the attacking force, on we went again, retiring. August 29th. A dispatch was read to us from General French, explaining that the BEF was on the west of a sort of horseshoe, and that the retirement was to draw the Germans right into it when they would be nipped off. That afternoon, we went to a place called Shawnee to guard the river while some REs blew up the bridges. It was a change from the everlasting marching, and we managed to get some vegetables out of the gardens and cook them. A few Uhlans appeared, but got away again in spite of our fire. So far as I could tell, there wasn't a single civilian in the town, and all the houses were barricaded, while outside of them were buckets of wine, pink, blue, red, whitish, and other colors. We were not allowed to drink any. August 30th. Just as we were leaving Shawnee, about 4 a.m., two girls were found and were taken along with us. Although all the bridges were blown up, the Germans were after us almost immediately. God only knew how they got over so soon. Their fire was heavy but high. The few we saw were firing from their hips as they advanced. We fired for about half an hour. Then the artillery came into action, and we retired about 2 or 3 miles under cover of their fire. Then we waited till the Germans came up, and we began all over again, and then again, and then again, all day long. It was terribly tiring, heartbreaking work, as we seemed to have the measure of the Germans, and yet we retired. During the evening, the Guards Brigade took over the rear guard work, while our brigade went on to Castle Isoy and bivouacked and slept for about 6 hours. August 31st. Again, we were rear guard, but did little fighting. We marched instead, staggering about the road like a crowd of gypsies. Some of the fellows had puttees wrapped around their feet instead of boots. Others had soft shoes they had picked up somewhere. Others walked in their socks with their feet all bleeding. My own boots would have disgraced a tramp, but I was too frightened to take them off and look at my feet. Yet they marched until they dropped, and then somehow got up and marched again. One man, Ginger Gilmore, found a mouth organ, and, despite the fact that his feet were bound in blood soaked rags, he staggered along at the head of the company playing tunes all day. Mostly he played The Irish Immigrant, which is a good marching tune. He reminded me of Captain Oates. An officer asked me if I wanted to turn on his horse, but I looked at the fellow on it and said, "No thanks." The marching was getting on everyone's nerves, but as I went, I kept saying to myself, if you can, force your heart, nerve, and sinew. Just that, over and over again. That night, we spent the time looking for an Ulan regiment, but didn't get in touch with them, and every time we stopped, we fell asleep. In fact, we slept while we were marching and consequently kept falling over. September 1st. We continued at the same game from dawn till dark and dark till dawn, marching and fighting and marching. Every roll call there were fewer to answer. Some were killed, some wounded, and some who had fallen out were missing. During this afternoon, we fought for about 3 hours near Villers Cotterets, I think it was, but I was getting very mixed about things, even mixed about the days of the week. 15 men in my company were killed, one in a rather peculiar fashion. He was bending down, handing me a piece of sausage, and a bullet ricocheted off a man's boot and went straight into his mouth and out of the top of his head. We got onto the road about 200 yards only in front of a German brigade, and then ran like hell for about a mile. until we passed through the South Staff's regiment, who were entrenched each side of the road. I believe about 6 of the battalion were captured. Still, we marched on until dusk. Then an outpost again, and during the night, the South Staffs passed through us. September 2nd. At 2 a.m., we moved off and marched all day long. It was hot and dusty, and the roads were rotten. But as we got mixed up with hundreds of refugees, we were obliged to keep better marching order. About 6 p.m. to 8 p.m., we reached Mew. I believe we did about 25 miles that day, but no fighting. We bivouacked outside Mew, but I went into the cathedral when we halted near it and thought it was very beautiful. Also, I saw some of the largest tomatoes I have ever seen in my life growing in a garden. I was rounding up stragglers most of the night until 1 a.m., and at 3 a.m., we moved off again. September 3rd. The first 4 or 5 hours we did without a single halt or rest, as we had to cross a bridge over the Ain before the REs blew it up. It was the most terrible march I have ever done. Men were falling down like ninepins. They would fall flat on their faces on the road, while the rest of us staggered round them, as we couldn't lift our feet high enough to step over them. And as for picking them up, that was impossible, as to bend meant to fall. What happened to them, God only knows. An airplane was following us most of the time, dropping iron darts. We fired at it a couple of times, but soon lost the strength required for that. About 9 a.m., we halted by a river, and immediately 2 fellows threw themselves into it. Nobody, from sheer fatigue, was able to save them, although one sergeant made an attempt and was nearly drowned himself. I, like a fool, took my boots off and found my feet were covered with blood. I could find no sores or cuts, so I thought I must have sweated blood. As I couldn't get my boots on again, I cut the sides away, and when we started marching again, my feet hurt like hell. We marched till about 3 p.m. Nothing else, just march, march, march. I kept repeating my line, if you can, force, etc. Why, I didn't know. A sergeant irritated everyone who could hear him by continually shouting out, stick it, lads, we're making history. The colonel offered me a ride on his horse, but I refused, and then wished I hadn't, as anything was preferable to the continuous marching. We got right back that afternoon among the refugees again. They were even worse off than we were, or at least they looked it. We gave the kids our biscuits and bully, hoping that would help them a little, but they looked so dazed and tired there did not seem to be much hope for them. At 8 p.m., we bivouacked in a field and slept till dawn. Ye gods, what a relief. September 4th, I was sent with 6 men on outpost to a small wood on our left front, and I had not posted the sentries more than half an hour before an officer found 2 of them asleep. The poor fellows were afterwards tried by court martial and shot. About 3 p.m., we all moved off again and came into action almost immediately, although I believe it was a food convoy that was mistaken for German artillery by our artillery. Anyway, no one I knew was hurt. It was said, however, that Jerry rushed his troops along after us in lorries. All through the night we marched, rocking about on our feet from the want of sleep, and falling fast asleep even if the halt lasted only a minute. Towards dawn, we turned into a farm, and for about 2 hours I slept in a pigsty. I noticed the same thing about that farm that I noticed about most French farms. It was, although they seemed more intensively cultivated than English farms, the farm implements were very old fashioned. September 5th. Early on this morning, reinforcements from England joined us, and the difference in their appearance and ours was amazing. They looked plump, clean, tidy, and very wide awake, whereas we were filthy, thin, and haggard. Most of us had beards. What equipment was left was torn. Instead of boots, we had puttees, rags, old shoes, field boots, anything and everything wrapped round our feet. Our hats were the same, women's hats, peasants' hats, caps, any old covering, while our trousers were mostly in ribbons. The officers were in a similar condition. After the reserves joined, we marched about 20 miles to a place called Chalmes. It was crowded with staff officers. We bivouacked in a park and then had an order read to us that the men who had kept their overcoats were to dump them, as we were to advance at any moment. Strangely, a considerable amount of cheering took place then. I discovered that the company I was in covered 251 miles in the retreat from Mons, which finished on September 5th, 1914. Corporal Bernard John Denor, 1st Royal Berkshire Regiment, 6th Brigade and Division, 1st Army Corps, in action at Battle of and Retreat from Mons, Battle of the Marne, the Aisne, about 2 months, First Battle of Ypres, in the salient 4 weeks, wounded at Zonnebeck in 7 places, and hospital at Boulogne, London, and Reading. End of section 1. Section 2 of Every Man at War. 60 Personal Narratives of the War, edited by Charles Benjamin Purdom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Linehart. An Old Contemptible et Locato by R.G. Hill. On August 5th, 1914, I reported to my regimental depot, being an Army reservist. What a meeting of old friends! All were eager to take part in the great scrap which every pre-war soldier had expected. At the depot, all was bustle, but no confusion. In the mobilization stores, every reservist's arms and clothing were ticketed, and these were soon issued with webbing equipment. About 300 men were then selected and warned to hold themselves in readiness to proceed to the south coast to make up the war strength of the battalion stationed there. There was great competition to go with this draft, the writer being one of the lucky ones to be selected. We entrained next morning, then another meeting with old chums. That night, bully, biscuits, emergency rations, and ammunition were issued. Surplus kit was handed in, and next night the battalion entrained for an unknown destination. We eventually arrived in Yorkshire, and after a fortnight's strenuous training, left for the south of England again to join our division. By this time we had welded together, and were a really fine body of men, hard as nails, average age about 25, and every man with the idea that he was equal to 3 Germans. Splendid men, enthusiastic and brave, going to fight, they thought, for a righteous cause. We embarked for France and landed at Boulogne on the morning of August 23rd. What a contrast between us and the slipshod, undersized French territorials who were guarding the docks. In their baggy red trousers and long blue coats, they looked like comic opera soldiers. We looked smart in our new khaki, and training had made us broad chested and clean looking. We disembarked and marched through the narrow streets of Boulogne, singing popular songs. The enthusiasm of the French people was unbounded. They broke our ranks to shower gifts upon us, and many a blushing Tommy was kissed by men and women. A few hours in camp, where we had to be guarded by gendarmes to save us from excited female admirers, and we entrained, leaving buttons and badges behind as souvenirs. A tedious journey in horse trucks followed. The line was littered with empty bully tins and woodbine packets, showing that British troops had passed that way before. We detrained just outside Le Cateau station. The town was in confusion, as Mons had just been fought. Refugees, troops, and ammunition columns creating a dust that choked us. Civilians offered us foaming jugs of weak beer, but discipline was so strong that to accept it meant a court martial. We marched out of the town along a typical French road. Just when we were about all in, a halt was called for dinner, which we never had as an outburst of artillery fire was heard. It must have been miles away, but we had orders to open out to artillery formation and proceed. We saw no enemy that day, and at night bivouacked in a cornfield where we enjoyed a long delayed dinner. We marched off in column of fours next morning at dawn in a new direction. At noon we halted, piled arms, and rations were issued, the last for many days. Men were told off to dig trenches on rising ground to our left. Whilst so engaged, an airplane hovered over us. It had no distinguishing mark, and we thought it was French, but were soon disillusioned as it scattered colored lights over us. Too late, we opened fire. Soon large black shells were bursting in the beet field just in front of our improvised position. Rain then started, the shelling ceased, and a regiment of our cavalry came galloping up and jumped over us in our hastily constructed trench. We stayed there till nightfall, incidentally wiping out a small Ulan patrol that blundered upon us. When we withdrew, we could hear the jingle of accouterments of many men approaching. That night we seemed to march round and round a burning farmhouse. Day broke, and we were still dragging our weary limbs along in what seemed to us to be an everlasting circle. At last the word came to halt and fall out for a couple of hours' rest. We had been marching along a road with a high ridge on the right and cornfields on the left. High up the ridge ran a road parallel to ours, on which one of our regiments had been keeping pace with us. We had no sooner sunk down in the cornfield on our left than shrapnel began to burst over us. Our officers were fine leaders. Man the ditch on the road, came the order. In the meantime, the battalion on the ridge had been caught napping by a squadron of Uhlans, who charged them while they were falling out for a rest. Our eager young officers went frantic with excitement. On their own initiative, they led us up the hill to the rescue of our comrades. With wild shouts, we dashed up. At first, the ground was broken and afforded cover for our short, sharp dashes. We then came to a hedge with a gap about 4 yards wide. A dozen youngsters made for the gap, unheeding the advice of older soldiers to break through the hedge. Soon that gap was a heap of dead and dying, as a machine gun was trained on it. We reached an open field where we were met with a hail of shrapnel. Officers were picked off by snipers. A subaltern rallied us and gave the order to fix bayonets. A piece of shrapnel carried half his jaw away. Upwards we went, but not a sign of a German. They had hidden themselves and waited for our mad rush. Officers and sergeants being wiped out and not knowing where the enemy really were, our attack fizzled out. A staff officer came galloping amongst us, mounted on a big black charger. He bore a charmed life. He shouted something unintelligible, which someone said was the order to retire. The survivors walked slowly down, puzzled and baffled. They had attained nothing and had not even seen the men they set out to help. We lost half the battalion in that wild attack. Then came our turn to do something better. The survivors, under the direction of a capable major, dug in and waited to get their own back. A battery of our 18-pounders started to shell the ridge. Suddenly, shells started falling round the guns. One direct hit, and a gunner's leg fell amongst us. The battery was wiped out. Tired and worn out, we waited. Towards afternoon, shrapnel played on us, fortunately without serious result. Then it was our turn to laugh. German infantry were advancing in close formation. They broke at our first volley. Something seemed to sting my leg. I found a shrapnel bullet had plowed a shallow groove down the fleshy part of my thigh. The enemy advanced. Another volley, and they broke again. My leg began to pain me, so I hobbled along the road to a house which was being used as a dressing station. A long queue of wounded men were waiting to be dressed, whilst a crowd of thirst maddened unwounded were crowding round a well in the garden. Despairing of medical aid, I begged a field dressing and, catching sight of a sunken road, turned into it and dressed my wound. In this sunken road, I found battalion headquarters. At dusk, they retired, I with them. I learned afterwards that all our wounded were captured that night, and small bodies of our troops, trying to retire in the darkness, had fired on each other. This was our part in the Battle of Le Cateau. Then began the retreat. I must have fainted, for I remember hobbling along with some chums, and next I found myself tied to the seat of an ammunition limber. We came to a village jammed with the retiring troops, where an artillery officer bundled me off. Fortunately, some of my own regiment passed, and seeing me lying in the road, helped me along. My legs seemed easier, and I was able to proceed at the pace my footsore companions were going. It was nightmare marching. Our party was now about 150 strong. Sleep was out of the question, and food was begged from villagers. Reaching St. Quentin, we had great hopes of rest, but were told that we were surrounded. We lay down to die through sheer weariness, but a staff officer rounded us up and got us out just as the enemy entered. Tramp, tramp began. Engineers told us to hurry over the bridge at Ham as they were just about to blow it up. A little scrap a bit further on, then Noyon, where we snatched a night's sleep. One day we turned about. Other parties joined us, and we were told we were now advancing. We hardly believed it until we came upon dead Germans. That put new life in us. Advancing! Hurrah! Our part was very small up to the Aisne. We crossed the Marne without a scrap, and never met with opposition until we reached the heights the other side of that now famous river. Some of our brigade were not so fortunate and lost heavily from shell fire while crossing. Our position on the Aisne was not so bad. We dug in on top of the ridge beyond the river. We were 1,100 yards from the enemy, and every 4 days we retired to a vast, evil smelling cave where we got hot meals and remained for 2 days. Most of our casualties were caused when fetching water and rations from the village below. The battalion was made up with reserve men, and the weather continued fine. The trenches on our left were not so fortunate, as they were attacked nearly every night, this causing us to stand to all night. After a few weeks of this, we were relieved by French troops. By forced marches and a train journey, we reached St. Omer. One night there, and we boarded French motor vans. We soon found ourselves scrapping after we had disembarked at a small village. The enemy had dashed down and seized the next village, Mataran, and our first task was to drive them out. The place was held by a rear guard of machine gunners and could have been encircled and captured, but we were ordered to take it by a bayonet. We took it at a terrible cost, but found no enemy to bayonet. What few machine gunners were there had done their work well and fled in time. Then through Belul and Armentières, which the enemy abandoned without a fight. We were the first British troops in Armentières. As we marched through, the civilians went frantic with delight. The Germans had been there for a week and had committed the usual excesses of troops flushed with victory. The Highlanders in our brigade caused much amusement, the female part of the population shrieking with laughter at the dress of the Mademoiselle Soldats. Bread, beer, and tobacco were showered on us, and garlands of flowers hung on our necks and bayonets. However, a few hours only were our portion there, which we spent in a large flax factory wrecked by the enemy during their short stay. Off again, past a large lunatic asylum, on which shells were falling, the shrieks of the inmates sounding hideous. These poor devils were released, and some wandered into the firing line, and no doubt thought they had reached the infernal regions. The enemy took up a strong position at Hooplines, where, after several minor attacks to straighten the line, we dug in and then commenced the dreary trench warfare. I have not enlarged on the hardships of war up to now, as, being all healthy men and constantly on the move, we had not noticed them much. Settling down to inactive trench life, we soon discovered what a miserable state we were in. Most of the original men had left their spare kit and overcoats at Le Coteau, as we had received orders there to attack in fighting kit. We were in the front line at Hooplines 29 days at one stretch. I, for one, had neither shirt nor overcoat. My shirt had been discarded at the Aisne, being alive with vermin. Beards were common, and our toilet generally consisted of rubbing our beards to clear them of dried mud. Our trenches were generally enlarged dry ditches where we dug in when our advance was stopped. Sandbags were very scarce, and when it rained, the sides of the ditches fell in. However, at Hooplines, we were better off than the majority of British troops at that time. It was a fairly quiet position, and rations came up regularly and plentifully. Fetching rations was our worst job. as the enemy's powerful searchlights played along the roads leading to the trenches each night. There were always plenty of volunteers, however, for this job, as they had first to go at the rum, cigarettes, etc. At the back of our trench was a large farmhouse. It had been shelled to pieces, but it proved a godsend to us as we discovered the wine cellar intact. Dozens of bottles of good wine were conveyed to the trench. The one officer in the trench, not popular enough to be told of our find, must have been struck with the cheery lightheartedness of the men at this period. We were at last relieved and proceeded to a large brewery at Neep, where 4 days' rest, a bath, and clean underclothing made new men of us. This was our first good wash since leaving England. I had not worn a shirt for 6 weeks. Whilst bathing in large mesh tubs, our khaki was fumigated. This seemed to send the lice to sleep for a couple of days. Then they woke up and attacked with renewed vigor. A draft of returned wounded men joined us, and we left Neep to take up a position in front of Plegsteert Wood. We spent the winter there doing good work, barbed wiring and strengthening the position. The first Battle of Ypres was raging on our left. 4 days front line, four reserve, and four in billets, until in April 1915 we were pitched into that awful hell, Ypres, when the battalion was wiped out time after time. I lasted until Arras 1917, the only real victory I saw, when I received a longed for blighting one and got discharged. Private R.G. Hill went to France on August 22nd, 1914, with the 1st Battalion Royal Warwickshire Regiment and the 10th Brigade of the 4th Division. Except for a few days in hospital in 1915, served with this battalion until April 11th, 1917, when he was wounded in the face and was discharged medically unfit in March 1918. In action at Le Cateau, Marne, Aisne, Meteren, a little known but gallant fight, Armentières, Plegsteert, Ypres, 1915, the Somme, and Arras, 1917. End of section 2. Section 3 of
Hey creators, it's Rob here.
60 Personal Narratives of the War, edited by Charles Benjamin Purdom. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Ted Linehart. The First Battle of Ypres by J.F. Bell. I bade farewell to my right leg and to my career as a soldier outside a trench at Gelveld near Ypres on October 29th, 1914. In the First Battle of Ypres, the British were outnumbered by 7-1. On the previous evening, we took over trenches, not deep or elaborate ones, from an English regiment. I cannot say which regiment we relieved. Our sergeant, on entering the trench, heard the last man, as he was doing a hurried exit, say, "So long, Jock. Not arf a nice place. Jack Johnson all bleeding day." On that night there was no sleep, as we had to dig and dig to improve the trench, and were being fired at all night. At 5 a.m., a group of us were standing in the open. Everything had turned peaceful, admiring our now almost perfect trench, when hell seemed let loose. All the guns in Flanders seemed to have suddenly concentrated on our particular sector of the British front. When the artillery fire subsided, Germans sprang from everywhere and attacked us. My platoon held fast. We lost some good comrades. Then we were ordered to evacuate the trench and assist to hold a trench on the flank where the fighting was fiercest. I was a sergeant and was told to take and hold a certain part of the trench where the occupants had just been driven out. On rushing the trench and leaping into it, I found that the dead were lying 3 deep in it. After taking bearings, I told the men to keep under cover and detailed one man, Ginger Bain, as lookout. After what seemed ages, Ginger excitedly asked, "How strong is the German army?" I replied, 7 million. "Well," said Ginger, "here is the whole bloody lot of them making for us." We were driven from the trench, and those of us who were unscathed joined Lieutenant Brooke, who had come up with cooks, transport men, and men who had been wounded but could still use a rifle. Lieutenant Brooke was, outwardly, quite unperturbed, walking about the firing line, issuing orders as if on the barrack square. I had served under him for 9 years, and seeing him such a target for the enemy riflemen, I asked him to lie down, as I felt if he was hit, his loss at that particular time would be disastrous. He told me we must retake the trench I had been driven from, and to pick 20 men to do so. All the men were alike to me, men I had known for years, so I told 10 men on my right and 10 on my left to get ready to rush the trench. We succeeded in this. No artist or poet can depict a trench after fighting in its stark hellishness. If we could not be driven out of the trench, it seemed certain that we would be blown out of it. Shells kept landing near enough in front of or behind the trench to shake us almost out of it. Many got killed by rifle fire, Ginger Bain being the first, then Big Bruce, whom I boxed in a competition before going to France. I passed a message to Lieutenant Brooke informing him our numbers were so reduced that if attacked we could not hold the trench, and received back word that he had just been killed. The VC was posthumously awarded him. A message was then sent to me to retire and join a platoon entrenched near us. I gave instructions to the few men, 8 I think, to retire along the communication trench, and I would join them at the head of it and lead them to our new position. I slipped over the rear of the trench to cut across and meet the lads as they emerged from the communication trench, but had only gone about 6 yards when I received what in the regiment was called the dull thud. I thought I had been violently knocked on the head, but feeling I was not running properly, I looked down and discovered that my right foot was missing. Somehow, I stood watching men running along the communication trench. My power of speech had left me, so I could speak to none of them. Then I swooned into the trench. No one had seen me being wounded, but one of the men, Pipe Adams, on missing me, returned to look for me. On seeing me lying quite helpless, he prepared to lift and carry me out of the trench. I told him I was too heavy, that it was too dangerous, and that in time our regiment would retake all the ground lost when I would be safe. When I think of the war comradeship, of unaffected and unknown bravery, I think of Pipe Adams, killed later, telling me, Christ, Jerry, my nickname, I could not leave you here. However, confident that our people would return, I persuaded him to go. I then put a field dressing and a shirt from my pack over my stump and lay down to wait further developments. In this trench, there would be about 60 badly wounded British soldiers, mostly Gordons, of all ranks. The soldier nearest me was a sergeant of the Grenadiers, who was severely wounded in both arms and both legs. I noticed a watch quite close to me. On looking at it, I found the time was 9 a.m. I must have dropped into a kind of stupor, and I woke suddenly with a noise of great shouting. I thought it was our fellows returned to their old position, imagined I heard voices I knew, also that of my company officer, Captain Burnett, shouting, Where are you, Sergeant Bell? I tried to rise, failed, but kept shouting, Here I am, in this trench, sir. Judge my surprise when two German infantrymen jumped into the trench. One of them got quite excited, raised his rifle, leveled at and within a yard of me, but the other knocked his mate's rifle up and asked me when and where I was wounded. I asked them to try and do something for the wounded grenadier, but they seemed in great haste as they jumped out of the trench. It was then 12 noon. So ended one morning in Flanders. I pass over the afternoon with its incessant artillery fire and the long night. There were periods of heavy gunfire, periods of silence, periods when all the wounded, those still alive, were shouting for stretcher bearers, praying for death, moaning noisily and quietly with pain. Strange the thoughts that pass through one under such circumstances. I thought of a great grandfather of mine who fought in the Peninsular War and was badly wounded at the Battle of Waterloo. Then I would think of a picture I once saw of a trench during the Balkan War. I had considered the picture was overdrawn, and now I knew that it was not horrible enough for the real thing. The Germans had taken a lot of ground, were busily consolidating their new position, And all morning, the 30th, groups of them and individuals kept looking into the trench. Two German officers slowly and quietly walked along the trench, and when they saw me still alive, they appeared greatly surprised. Each of them spoke to me in English, inquiring how long I had been lying there. They informed me that there were 57 of my comrades dead in the trench, and that I was one of three still alive. One of them promised to send someone to pick me up, but I had doubts about him doing so. However, about an hour later, four German private soldiers arrived, bringing a waterproof sheet to carry me off. They gave me a drink of cold coffee, and when I pointed out the grenadier, one of them went back into the trench and gave the grenadier a drink and made him comfortable before rejoining us. One of the Germans could speak English, and in his deep spoken voice said, "Ah, Scotlander, you lucky man, get out of this damned war. It lasts long time. What we fight for? Ah, German army and English navy, both damned nuisance." They carried me with great care to a barn about half a mile away that was being used as a dressing station. All the way from the trench to the barn, I saw British dead, mostly Highlanders, Black Watch, Camerons, and Gordons, and as they lay there in their uniforms, I thought how young and lonely they looked. My arrival at the barn caused a mild sensation. All the soldiers on duty near and in the barn coming to the door to see me being carried in. Scotlander, Sergeant, nay helmet, I was bareheaded, being remarks made to me. The officer in charge of the barn excitedly asked me, "Knives and revolvers you got?" Replying with a smile in the negative, he gave me a cigarette and told some men to lift me and lay me on top of some straw. I asked for a drink and was given more cold coffee. I looked at a wristlet watch the man who gave me the drink was wearing. It was then 1 p.m., so another morning in Flanders had gone. Sergeant J.F. Bell, 2nd Gordon Highlanders, proceeded with 7th Division to Zeebrugge, took part in the fighting round Ypres in October 1914, wounded and taken prisoner of war October 29th.
And when you go, I will fall back apart. Find pieces of me all over the yard. In this house of cards. Just as if there were just too many days. When all good intentions only got in. And I just never know where I should sit. Maybe nothing nowhere else that old. In this house of cards. With all they are. You cannot breathe what you never did.
I got rejected there. still coming down to the bottom. So regardless of what it's doing, I think it's still bearish. So basically, Sui is in a bad downtrend. I don't think he will come back from this downtrend at all. So if he keeps standing there, he could get rejected. Mm. So I think in the next few days, next few days, next few hours, Sui may I think it's either needs to break that or it needs to correct really badly. So that the 90 cent isn't that bad, but I'm afraid if it falls from that, then we are gonna see 85 cents or lower. So I don't know. I need to finish this live stream and get out of there. Let's play a little bit of game first. Let's play a game until it dies. Or should we start another? Let's see what we can do. All right, so let's. All right, guys.